And through your day to day, these questions, they don't really hinder you, do they? They're more something in the back of your head. You're still enjoying life. I know you're still enjoying life. I know recently it seems like you've gone on from a holiday for ages.
Yeah.
Was that a good time for you to sort of, take stock, cut out the noise, bit
Yeah.
of a rethink? I know COVID is a conversation I've had with many, many people. It's all changed us in some shape or form. Has that given you, has that break given you a bit of a new lease on sort of life, so to speak?
I wouldn't say a new lease of life, but I think it's helped me run like a certain experiment that I've been wanting
Interesting.
to run that I've been wanting to
Okay.
run for a while.
Wow.
So what I did during my break, I went off to Bali and I went to the south of Bali and I just pretty much stayed at a resort and sat on the beach for a couple of weeks really. But what I did was I just turned everything the fuck off. Like no news, no mobile, no
Wow.
laptop, nothing. Literally nothing.
Nothing. So the
Nothing.
phone was literally turned off.
It was turned off. I did
Brilliant.
not receive communication from anyone for that time. And
Wow.
what and
Okay.
what I and what it made me realize was that like so much of what happens in like the news cycle of what we read kind of adds to that level of stress that we kind of experience. Like we read all these events that are happening overseas, we read all these events that are impacting us, we're reading things on inflation, we're reading things on like property prices, like all this shit that's pretty much constantly happening. But then what you realize is that you can go off for like 3 weeks, turn everything off, come back and shit's the same. you know? So realistically,
But
like
you have a
it,
shitload of notifications.
you have a shitload of notifications, but like nothing's changed. I mean, think things don't necessarily move as fast as people may think that they do. Like a
And
lot
it's
of
probably not as important as you think it is.
that's exactly right, and a lot of shit that like that we think is important is not that important, and a lot of things that you think that other people think are important are not that important. So yeah,
Really?
that experiment
People.
kind of yeah.
So 2 weeks, no zero technology.
Hmm.
How did you feel?
Pretty damn great. Like I'm going to do it more often. Um, Maybe even in 6 month cycles actually. Just turning off for a while every 6 months is
Hmm.
probably something that I'm seriously considering right now.
Because when I go on holidays, I do the same thing. I turn off.
Mm,
And the beauty of traveling overseas is that when you get a new SIM card, I get a new SIM card because obviously I might need to call my wife, check on the kids and whatnot. But that's purely to make phone calls. So there's no data. So when you have no data, you can't really do anything. Why did you want to do that first, Boris? Why did you decide yourself that, hey, I want to do this experiment? What was your motivation?
um, it's something that I've always wanted to do for a long time. Like I think it was at the start of COVID when it kind of dawned on me. At the time, I was like all of a sudden put in a position where I had a lot more time to myself. I guess you can say. Like there was a lot more working from home. The whole travel component of life was kind of cut away. So all of a sudden, you have all these extra hours where you can kind of pay more attention to other things that might be happening around you. And then I started noticing things like different narratives that I kind of pushed onto you through different
Mm,
like news outlets and whatever else. And then all of a sudden you realize that there's so much information coming your way, and there's so many different narratives that are trying to put you in their own little tribe of operating, and it's just exhausting if you really pay a lot of attention to it. So at that point in time, I kind of asked myself like, what would happen if you just switched off completely, just dropped all the different narratives, dropped all the different information sources, and just like went back to nature, basically, you know. And when I say
mm.
nature, like I mean, sitting on a beach or whatever, but just going back to a
A,
more
t-
basic form, right?
a time before the iPhone.
Yeah, a time before the iPhone, because that like, and that's a great point. Like the whole mobile device and social media stuff, like we don't even know what kinds of impacts like these devices and those platforms are having on our society, right? Like there's definitely a correlation with like mental health and whatever else when it comes to the social media side of things.
Hmm.
And being constantly connected is probably not too good of a thing either. So yeah.
You know, it's interesting. In the prior podcast, I had a chat to a CEO of a logistics firm, and we talked about Slack. I'm still scared of Slack.
Why is that?
I'm scared. Like there were days where I would wake up and I wouldn't want to pick up my phone because I
Mm.
was just that afraid of the Slack notifications. That notification style sometimes still scares me when I hear it.
But why is that though? Is that because like you kind of correlated it to work or like issues or like what's why
Pretty
why
much.
Slack
Like
specifically?
the only time I'll hear about it when there was something going wrong.
Right. So you would only get messages when shit was on fire.
Basically, there was no conversation. It was basically I have this fire, I need help.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, you know, Slack or any sort of business communication application has its purpose. But for me, you're right. I did attribute it to it as an alarm going in the back of my head whenever that ping came on board. Um,
Did you do anything to kind of overcome that, or is it still kind of like a thing? Or
if I were to create an organization, I would
yeah,
think twice before implementing an instant messaging application. Dare I say, if there was a need, I would talk to the vendor and say that we need to limit. There's got to be a way where you limit the amount of messages that get sent per day. Like I think there's a purpose for it, but it just became too easy.
mm.
And the use of technology is very much a disciplined approach. Yeah, my conclusion is that I would think twice before I implement an instant messaging tool based
But
upon
do
my experience.
you think like the benefits outweigh the cons? I guess like that's an actual interesting conversation to have. You know, like is the benefit of instant messaging a net boon in terms of like innovation and kind of getting things done compared to the, I guess, downsides of stress and whatever else, you know, like in the context of business and Slack and whatever.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you're an organization and you've clearly stated what the guardrails are, and you have really defined how the organization should be utilizing this instant messaging platform, that in itself requires a lot of thinking. You might reduce the number of rooms. You might cap certain groups to a certain number. I think on a relative basis, if an organization had the right guidelines of usage, I would say that the benefits, yes, would outweigh the cons. But you need to have those guidelines in place because if you don't, it's just too much. Because when you
Did
think
you?
about it, right, you've got Slack, you've got your personal applications. So I thought I was actually quite clever by separating my work phone with my personal phone.
Mm.
And to a degree, it was actually quite beneficial in the sense that I could actually turn it off during the weekend. Now, like you, after the 2 weeks you got back from Bali, I'm sure you would have just had a ton of messages when you just turned on mobile network, right? So for me, when the Monday morning kicked around, I suppose that's where the fear kicked in was that since I turned it off during the weekend, the Monday morning at 8 o'clock when I turned it on, you were like boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, I still haven't gone through all of them, to be fair, even now.
Even now, wow. So it just goes to show you how much sort of communication is going through it.
Mhm.
How about you? Do you agree that the pros outweigh the cons, or
I don't know. I find it like an interesting debate to have. Like, but for me, that that debate would be interesting for the whole like social media aspect and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Like, do we kind of have a limit on social media interaction, you know, like is that communication more damaging than something like Slack, right? Like
True. I suppose if you have a disciplined approach to it, well, like anything in life, right? As long as you do it in moderation, it's okay, right? Now, for you and I, I think we had the best of both worlds in a sense of basically I'll define life nowadays as basically pre-iPhone and
yep.
post-iPhone.
Mhm.
And I think you and I, we had the luxury, so to speak, of living in a time which is pre-iPhone. Um, I think if one has a discipline to limit him or herself, obviously that's very subjective, right? I think that's the way forward. But how do you then instill that discipline into the younger generation who literally grew up with a handheld?